Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dee Dee Petri, President and CEO of the National Association for Olmsted Parks, the managing partner of the Olmsted 200 campaign. Can you believe it? Olmsted has turned 200. We are grateful to communities across America and hundreds of celebration partners who helped us ring in this special birthday. I hope you will go to our blog where you can see photos from our events in New York City, including our FLO Big Head, as well as moving tributes to Olmsted by Lori Olin, Sarah Zodi, and Mike Messner. And don't miss out on thousands of creative birthday posts at our @Olmsted200 Instagram. And remember, Olmsted 200 is not about a single day or a single year. Olmsted 200 is about the future, ensuring parks for all people and renewing public support for Olmsted's historic and natural assets. We invite everyone to participate in the vast array of programs, tours, and conferences happening from coast to coast, and to explore the life and principles of Olmsted and their relevance to today's problems. The birthday is only the beginning. Please visit olmsted200.org to learn more and to watch our ever-changing calendar and blog. In just a few weeks, we'll head west to Chicago, where we will celebrate Olmsted in Henry Hobson Richardson's landmark Glessner House, followed by a visit to the National Carillon Congress on the University of Chicago campus, an opportunity to hear the special concert inspired by Olmsted, and then tour Chicago's Olmsted Parks with Parks historian Julia Bachrach. Sign up now to join us. Today, we're going to continue our examination of the evolution of Olmsted's thinking about parks for all people. Our topic, Olmsted and the Writing Life, aims to look more broadly at Olmsted as author, letter writer, journalist, and advocate. Indeed, before finally settling down full-time as a landscape architect in 1865, it looked like Olmsted might become a writer or a journalist. We see him taking pen to paper publicly for the first time at age 29, when he writes about Birkenhead, the People's Park in Liverpool, in Andrew Jackson Downing's publication, The Horticulturalist. By the end of his life, Olmsted had written 5 books and many treatises. He had crafted thousands of articles and letters and produced and often paid for the publication and distribution of numerous reports. Today, the Olmsted Archives at the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site contains over 1 million original documents related to the more than 6,000 landscape design projects undertaken by Olmsted and the Olmsted firms. The Library of Congress houses thousands of pages of correspondence, and there, until June 5, you can see a superb bicentennial exhibit on Olmsted's life and career. The exhibit highlights the Frederick Law Olmsted Papers collection in the manuscript division of the library, as well as selections from general collections and the prints and photographs division, with reproductions from the Olmsted Archives in Brooklyn and the National Park Service. Thanks go to curator Barbara Baer. We also invite you to check out the 12 volumes of the Olmsted Papers, edited by Charles Beveridge and recently digitized by the University of Virginia Rotunda imprint. To take us on our exploration today, we are joined by 3 scholars and a terrific moderator who have a special perspective and insight into Olmsted's writing life. Moderating is Harold Holzer, American historian and leading authority on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era. A prolific writer and lecturer himself, Harold was chairman of the Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation and co-chairman of the Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, so he knows about bicentennial celebrations. He was also the recipient of the National Humanities Medal in 2008, and he has authored, co-authored, or edited 54 books. His latest major book is The President versus the Press: The Endless Battle Between the White House and the Media, from the Founding Fathers to Fake News. Our panelists today include Pulitzer Prize-winning author Geraldine Brooks, whose new novel, Horse, is due out on June 14. Geraldine is a member of our Olmsted 200 Honorary Committee and a thoughtful commentator on Olmsted. Her late husband, Tony Horwitz, wrote the superb book retracing Olmsted's travels through the South, Spying on the South. From the New York Times, we welcome James Barron, Metro columnist and reporter, who will help us compare journalistic mores yesterday and today and examine Frederick Law Olmsted, the journalist. When James is not writing columns, he's writing books as well. So I urge you to check out not only his columns, but books on the making of a Steinway concert grand and high stakes stamp collecting. We are also mighty pleased to have editor and publisher of The Nation, Katrina Vandenhoevel, who can literally thank Frederick Law Olmsted for making her job possible. In developing plans for The Nation, Olmsted proposed, and I quote, more careful, accurate, and elaborate discussion of political, economical, and commercial topics than is possible in the columns of the daily press. That's surely a goal that is as relevant today as it was in Olmsted's time. So with this, Harold will start off the conversation with a brief overview and then open discussion with our panelists. Today, I'm going to field questions from the audience, so we invite you to enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll take questions near the end of the hour. With that, let me turn this over to Harold. Welcome.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Thank you for setting the stage and framing our discussion for yet another look at yet another aspect of Olmsted's extraordinary life and achievements. And I was at an event not long ago at which someone asked, why is Calvert Vaux not given as much attention as Frederick Law Olmsted? The answer given, not by me, by some other very wise person, was, well, he had the power of the pen as well as the power of the blueprint. This was not to say that he was a self-promoter, but he was promoting his projects. And it's good to have an opportunity to discuss Olmsted the writer, because there is a lot to appreciate and analyze. Dee Dee mentioned that in 1851, he started off with his article on the People's Park for the Horticulturist, writing about Liverpool. But he soon returned to this side of the pond and wrote Walks and Talks of the American Farmer, 2 volumes that perhaps have not been cracked in recent decades, but the launching of a prolific career. In that same year, 1852, as we'll discuss in more detail in a few moments, Charles Loring Brace introduced him to the New York Times, and he began a career as a kind of a domestic Tocqueville or Dickens, looking at American society and American landscape at the same time, contributing a great deal to Northern understanding of the institution of slavery as not only a cruel system, but a corrupting one to the white people who were engaged in that society. You might say that what Uncle Tom's Cabin was in fiction, Olmsted was in prose, and we don't hear about that as often. 50 articles for the New York Times in the next couple of years. And then beginning in 1856, a series of books extrapolated from his New York Times columns, but carefully edited. A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States was the first. Then A Journey Through Texas, I love the subtitle, or A Saddle Trip on the Southwestern Frontier. A Journey to the Back Country in 1860. Again, in all of these, wonderful descriptions of the landscape, but also extraordinarily vivid and disturbing portrayals of slavery. And then in 1861, the abridgment, the famous abridgment that he subsequently sent to Abraham Lincoln with folded down corners instructing him what he needed to read. We can talk more about the impact of his recommendations on Lincoln and the Civil War. And that was called The Cotton Kingdom, a traveler's observations on cotton and slavery. He also wrote letters to the New York Tribune. I don't know if other times people were permitted to do that in their day. In 1855, he also served as an editor of Putnam's magazine and came into contact with great literary figures on both sides of the Atlantic. Washington Irving, Longfellow, Emerson, and in 1866, as we will hear later, was one of the founding editors of The Nation, which survives, fortunately, to this day and thrives to this day. Dee Dee mentioned that he was also a prolific, penetrating, rather insistent, maybe prolix letter writer. The letter to Lincoln is so long, I'm almost certain he never read it through, but he did try. And I will, before I ask my colleagues to join the discussion, I will talk about one book I think rather neglected, but rather important, an 1863 book called Hospital Transports, a memoir of the Peninsula Campaign. It was a disastrous Union military effort, failing to capture Richmond and end the war 3 years before it ultimately ended. But during this period, Olmsted was serving as the director of the Sanitary Commission for the United States. And his memoir details the astonishingly prescient work he did in sanitizing hospital facilities, in taking out the walls of ships so that air could flow and help preserve the lives of amputees and those suffering from typhus. No one seemed to have any idea about germs and disease, but somehow Olmsted was doing what we call deep cleaning in the COVID world. So amazing work all through, journalistically, in books, and in these guides, of course, to landscape and his projects. So let's start with his work for the New York Times, and I think we'll ask Geraldine to speak first, and then James, of course, who has been at the Times almost as well. He's almost ready for a bicentennial of his own at the Times, but let's start with Geraldine, please.
Well, I came to Fred, as we call him in this house, through osmosis, when my husband decided to retrace his journeys through the South. So Tony Hoyt set off very much in the same spirit as Fred had done. Fred was a tremendously curious, passionate, open-hearted person. This was a young man who hadn't yet found himself in life, but he had thrown himself into at least 3 careers already. And as a journalist, what strikes me the most is he was incredibly modern in his approach, in that he wasn't looking at his reporting as something you do from the top down, sitting and talking with the important people. He was looking at it from the bottom up, and he was going out there to put himself in the path of adventure, or as he put it himself, place oneself in situations and circumstances where one will be most liable to accidents. And I love that phraseology because it was the accidents of his acquaintances on the road that gave him, I think, such deep insights. He said, do and go where one doesn't know what to expect. So he set out without a clear agenda, without even knowing where he would stay on any given night. He'd often be looking for that farmer who would take him in right up until dusk. And then he would spend the night and glean the thoughts of the person he was with. He did, of course, speak to influential people as well. And it's interesting, in his dispatches for the Times, I think the Times printed 64 of his dispatches and the Daily Tribune 10. And in all of them, he goes to some pains to conceal the identities of the people that he's talking to. So we know, for example, that he spent time with Cassius Clay in Lexington, Kentucky, because he was carrying letters from Clay when he left there. He never mentions meeting with Clay, but he has a wonderfully evocative description of being on a stagecoach where his fellow riders identify the brand on the pigs that are being herded north to Cincinnati, and says that these are Cash Clay's pigs. And then he brilliantly recounts the dialogue between the guys in the coach, who are all pro-enslavement and own slaves, but they still can't help but admire the bravery of Cassius Clay, who has freed all the slaves that he inherited and then founded a newspaper dedicated to emancipation. So he encounters people in real situations and then brings them vividly to us. And he does it, I think, in quite extraordinarily evocative language. And the other thing that I think is most important about him as a reporter, and we'll talk about this more later, is that he allows his mind to change as information is presented to him. He sets out saying he's interested in matter-of-fact matter, just the facts, ma'am, and that he's a moderate free soiler when he sets out, not a red-hot abolitionist, he says, but by the time he is working for the Sanitary Commission in the Civil War, because of his travels in the South, his mind has been completely changed. And at that point, he has a righteous hatred, as he describes it, for the institution of enslavement.
So thank you, Geraldine. I think the next step is, if I decided to go south and write my observations, I'm not sure I could convince the outgoing or incoming editor of the New York Times to publish 54 long articles. So I'd like to ask James, who has worked for several New York Times editors in his day, how Olmsted struck up this ongoing relationship with the founding editor, Henry Raymond.
Well, he got the job because of a 5-minute job interview. So Harold, maybe you have a chance if you keep it quick. By the way, thank you for including me. It's an honor to be here today. Part of it with Olmsted going to the South is, in effect, the people he was connected with that I think show how New York was really a small town. We say that sometimes in New York now, even though obviously there are 8 million of us here. But then in Olmsted's case, I think it's really because of 2 people. And one of them, Brace, Charles Loring Brace, is the one who made the connection with Henry Jarvis Raymond. Raymond had founded the New York Times in 1851. So it was barely 2 years old when Raymond sent him off. And Brace had known that Raymond was looking for someone to go to the South and report, as we would call it now. And so he made the introduction. The 5 minutes were well spent, and we've been reading it ever since. I think Olmsted gave the Times credibility. After all, as Dee Dee said to me once, the Times was pretty much still a startup when this was when Olmsted began writing, when he set off for the South, and no less, and Raymond really was a special figure in journalism, although he's overlooked now, I think, in many ways. No less a figure than Abe Rosenthal, who was the managing editor and the executive editor of the Times for 17 years, a generation ago now. Abe said, they don't make editors like Raymond anymore. I've come to think of Raymond as something of a juggler, not in the comic sense of someone who's clowning around, but what he had going on was multitasking, but it was so much beyond that. Not only was he a newspaper man, he was also a political figure. At one time or another, he was not only the publisher of the New York Times, he was in the New York State Assembly, he was the Speaker of the Assembly, he was a candidate for lieutenant governor, he played a significant role at the brand new Republican Party's first National Convention. That was in 1854. A decade later, he drafted a lot of Lincoln's re-election platform. 1864, of course, was also the year he became the chairman of the Republican National Convention and the year he was elected to Congress. An editor who doubled as an elected official, well, it wouldn't happen now. The Times has a handbook, which if I were better at visual props, I could hold up, but it's online. We have a handbook on ethics that says flatly, journalism has no place on the playing field of politics. And to its credit, the Times back then noted that when Raymond was in charge, the newspaper was never used to promote its editors' political fortunes. So If that's the credo, it's no wonder Raymond would want to send somebody off to see for himself. His approach to reporting, Raymond's, was he wanted the reporters to write what they saw, and Olmsted's approach was he would show us. He went into long descriptions. Geraldine mentioned a couple of them. And when he touched on slavery, as she said, he evolved. His approach was probably unusual for the time, because when he left, as Schlesinger put it, he was a disinterested and reliable witness of conditions in the Old South. And that's what Raymond wanted. That's exactly what Raymond wanted. He didn't want a polemicist. And even so, Raymond wasn't always happy with what he got. He complained to Brace, not directly to Raymond, because of course you don't go to the writer, you go to the intermediary. He complained that Olmsted went into way too much detail, which sometimes now it seems that, yes, he did. Even so, that served Olmsted really well, I think, because it showed he'd absorbed the information. He really understood it. He learned the technology of farming when he was a farmer on Staten Island. That turned out to be something that was useful when he finally got around to the technology of making parks. But in terms of explaining the South, he understood what it took to run a plantation better than almost anyone else. So there was the serendipity of hiring this not terribly successful, but not total failure of a farmer, and sending him off there. Olmsted's picture of the South, of course, wasn't pretty. He complained about the backwardness of the roads and the rails and the hotels. All of those are things that if you've ever traveled as a reporter, you do worry about, and you can read those descriptions and think about the times now where we have airplanes, that the plane was late coming in because of fog, and there's Olmsted who can't get across a river on a boat to the train, to the depot where the train hasn't come and won't be there for 2 more days or something like that. All of this made me think that what he was writing about was a region that had a different conception of time than he was accustomed to. He was efficient. He'd been efficient as a landowner and as a farmer. And in the South, he was startled by how little ambition there was, how little drive there was. Here was the North that he knew, and the North was remaking itself and making itself more efficient. And what he found in the South was the South wasn't. And yet here we are celebrating Olmsted and the work he did for the New York Times, which was unquestionably influential. Some people say it was the Cotton Kingdom that kept England from recognizing the Confederacy in the Civil War. In the 1890s, someone else said Olmsted's writings were more influential than Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is probably going too far. But it raises the question of what endured. And sadly, as far as writing goes, Olmstedians have to face a fact. None of the books about the New York Times mention him. Not Meyerberger in 1951, not Gay Talese in 1966, not Susan Tift and Alex. They're all on a bookshelf behind where you are. The camera's facing me and the bookshelf is back there. And there's one that I think is in the works now, and the person who's been working on it had nothing on Olmsted in the database he constructed. Here's this person whom we consider influential, who's almost forgotten. That's our Olmsted.
Thank you, James. We can come back to the unavoidably ephemeral nature of daily journalism.
Yes.
And whether we remember Olmsted and his New York Times contributions because they were preserved in somewhat edited form in books.
And also, I just say, you know, it was really the first rough draft of history, because he did go back after his opinions had matured and developed. And he very much takes the same material and tells the story with a great deal more strident opinion behind it in the books. And I think that that's why the books are remembered more than the first rough draft.
Yeah, yeah.
I will say also, I think before I hand it off to Katrina to talk about magazine journalism, I do want to touch for a moment on Olmsted as a letter writer. And the letters I'm most familiar with are those he directed as the CEO of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. In particular, one extraordinary screed that he wisely did not send to President Lincoln, he was meanwhile describing to his family as an idiot and as someone who smiled with his teeth and laughed with his mouth open and wore clothes that made him look like an applicant for a police job in New York City, whatever that meant, but it's funny. A long, long letter about how he should push out the publicity for the Emancipation Proclamation in such a way as to reach enslaved people so they took up arms for their own freedom and for the North, but also in such a way to assuage the fears of border state slaveholders and those who might be dissuaded from supporting the Union by fears of integration, an integrated biracial society. And although we do credit Olmsted with evolving on the issue of abolition and emancipation, in this one letter, he urges Lincoln to create linen printings of the Emancipation Proclamation. I love that he specified the medium for the posters. But alongside the Emancipation, he advised, please also print the New York Times transcript of your meeting with free African American leaders at the White House. Hardly Lincoln's finest moment, at which Lincoln urged the free African Americans to consider his plan for voluntary colonization in Central America or Africa, which they, more politely than he deserved, declined a few days later. He thought that it was important to publicize both policy initiatives of the Lincoln administration. Things are very complex where Olmsted and Lincoln are concerned. But in terms of mastering these media, he has a magazine career at Putnam's, and then after the war, Katrina has a brilliant, enduring idea. So please tell us about it.
So I sit here at the Nation offices, founded in July 1865. The opening line of the first issue, the week was singularly barren of exciting events. I have not lived, but it was 2 years earlier on a hot night in June 1863 at the Union Club, the Union League Club, forgive me, then at 17th Street, where Frederick Law Olmsted gave a talk in which he laid out his ideas for a weekly of culture and politics, a weekly magazine. And this was, he had come back from the South, as we've spoken about. He had been leading the US Sanitary Commission. But in this moment, he spoke not only about the nation, which by the way, could have been called scrutiny or hold fast. But he laid out a prospectus for a weekly journal, which he circulated among those attending the Union Club event. And it's not only a founding document of the nation, but I submit it's an entire school of American journalism. Dede spoke, he spoke of careful, candid, and conscientious journalism. It was as if it was his sort of description of the hot take journalism, so ubiquitous today. And he was a conservative in some ways, though he reported from below. There was a sense of a need for a weekly that stepped back from the hot pace, the hot takes of those times. Now, to be honest, we were founded amidst the telegraph and the letter writing. So we've seen the telegraph and Twitter. And I do think that Olmsted would have been pleased to read Thomas Carlyle or John Ruskin, or Henry James, who wrote for The Nation in hot takes, as I'm happy to read my colleague Joanne Wipajewski on Buffalo, or Greg Grandin on the shooting in Charleston. Those were written in a day, but had a sense of history and context. I mean, Frederick Law Olmsted was very prescient, but I don't know if he would have known how his lines were so relevant then, because a century and a half later, Olmsted words of criticism about a press marred by its pandering, quote, to the greatest number. There's something quite conservative about his belief that you wanted to speak, I don't know if I would say an elite, but to those who cared about words and ideas and arguments, and a slowness of pace, a rumination that is very possible in Central Park, or one of the parks that he built. He could never, I think, the federal government was growing, but not at the scale as it has now. I mean, but I think he understood how important it was to have an independent critical journal that stood for the ideals of democracy. He wrote for The Nation. He wrote maybe 10 pieces, and one of the great ones was about the Great Fire in Chicago, but he wrote about the parks and gardens of Paris, suburban home grounds, which is so interesting, and the genesis of a rumor. One thing that strikes me is that in 1865, he took off. He went to Yosemite, maybe before that. He came back in 1866. He took his 1/6 equity in The Nation, not Apple, but more, more enduring maybe. But he also, I think, and we don't have enough evidence of this, but The Nation from 1866 to 67 ran an unusual series called The South as It Is by someone called J. Richard Dennett. And it's been released, I think, Cornell University Press in the last decade. But how much did Frederick Law Olmsted play in that decision for The Nation to commit to go back to the South he had spent time in? He did change. He became part of a group. When you ask people of The Nation's founders, the first thing they'll say was a group of abolitionists. It was a group of moderate abolitionists. So few know that the architect, along with his colleague of Central Park, was one of the founders. But I think you see it in everyday. Just this past week, by the way, when we were writing about Buffalo, we wrote and asked, why is Buffalo among the most segregated cities in the nation? And it's partly because in the 50s and 60s, the city fathers decided to build an expressway. It destroyed a beautiful parkway designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. It broke the back of Buffalo's then middle class. So we are continuing to mine his history of both public space, of the impact of the crossing of public space with private. And I think the ability to conceive of a magazine that to this day has evolved is a great testament to his life and work. And I don't know if I was in the New York Historical Society the other day, and they have a little book, which I think is a wonderful, it's Lincoln and FDR and Frederick Law Olmsted and a few others, but it's very accessible, and it does mention the New York Times. So I recommend it, and I'm honored and grateful to be part of this with Olmsted experts. We're still learning more about our history as every day of 165, 66 years unfolds.
Thanks, Katrina. It's extraordinary how many aspects of journalism and fiction literature not the lead, as they say. Maybe it should be a second lead from now on. I'm interested in touching back on some of the things that all of us have said about his populism, that he went to see for himself, whether he was going to the South or I'm sure he went to Chicago, Katrina, to cover the aftermath of the Inferno, and yet he relied on some pretty important literary figures to push him to his great consummation, and that is, of course, becoming the head of the Central Park project. William Cullen Bryant, for instance, editor of a rival newspaper, the New York Evening Post, supported him, as did others. Washington Irving, for example, was one of those who recommended him. So what do we know what circles he moved in terms of fellow journalists, writers? We talked about Brace and others. James, you might weigh in on whether he stayed in touch with Raymond.
Raymond, who I don't know how closely they stayed in touch, and Raymond died in 1869, and it's interesting to think about what Reconstruction would have been like if he had still been on the national stage later than that. And as I say, they were close in age, Raymond and at Olmsted. Raymond was about 2 years older. But it was the world of New York that Olmsted moved in. And so I think the Times columns, it had to have been known here by the time he was done with them, and then sold the batch to the other paper that he had written them, even though they were not signed with his name. They were signed Yeoman consistently, but Yeoman became well known, and I think that had to have been known like an open secret. And so I think that affected his thinking as he went from thinking about slavery as being unconstitutional, and I think thinking he really didn't want to break up the Union. He really didn't want to abolish, he didn't want to risk that by just flat out abolishing slavery.
He left the nation in he took a piece of equity and he welcomed E.L. Godkin, who was the first editor of the Nation. But he disagreed with Godkin on some racial issues. He felt Godkin was famous, I'm going to get this wrong, I think Scottish, and Harvard has the Godkin lectures every year, but the Nation was surprisingly conservative in the old sense of the word about Reconstruction. It was, Godkin was very much about corruption, taking on the patronage systems in New York and the country, but he was not a populist, a multiracial populist, and he was quite elitist, more than Olmsted was, based on the reporting he had done around the country. And so there was a split there, as there was a split in the abolitionist movement to some extent, not to the extent that Godkin took it. And so Olmsted set off. And then when I think his book was published, it was important, The Cotton Kingdom, for his perspective.
Can I just pick up on something you said, Katrina, when you said he was not a radical, which is, I think, true for most of his life. During the Civil War, I think he reached the apogee of his radicalism, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have a radical effect. And my favorite anecdote is about a young Black inmate in prison in 1949, browsing the scanty shelves of the prison library, where he came across Olmsted's book. And he reported how shocked he was to read about slavery's total horror. And that young incarcerated man was Malcolm X.
That's extraordinary. I didn't mean as much Olmsted, but Godkin.
Oh, yes, right.
Godkin was, but it's that's extraordinary. The Nation to this day is it's different, but it's banned. We get every month we receive notice the Nation, and particularly its writings about race and incarceration, are banned from 2 or 3 prisons or jails in this country. But,
well, one might note that once Olmsted began publishing, his books were banned.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, they attacked viciously in Southern newspapers. If you read the reviews of Olmsted books, somewhat indifferent in Europe at the beginning, good reviews in New York and Boston, as you'd expect, and eviscerations from the people who are described in his writing. So he has a huge impact. I mean, just the honor of having a book or magazine banned is pretty profound, even today. I will also say that Raymond James was kind of on the wrong end of the Andrew Johnson impeachment, or the wrong side. He was kind of sympathetic to Andrew Johnson. He turned a bit conservative in those last years. And I think he was a bit tortured by it. Not that I'm diagnosing his collapse in his doorway and his death to the fact that so many people had abandoned him among his Civil War era colleagues. So in the brief time we have left before we open it to audience questions, I just want to ask everyone to weigh in on, I guess, the implicit question of the day. And that is, as we obviously, speaking about the lead, we celebrate Olmsted and his miraculous achievement in Central Park and Prospect Park and green space all over this country. Should there be a reevaluation, a reassessment, and a reappreciation of his importance and his impact as a writer, journalist, a writer, and a publisher? Geraldine, let's start with you.
Well, I think that we're living in an uncannily parallel period. Because he was somebody who believed in dialogue, believed it was worth having, believed that discussion with those with whom you did not agree was something that should be pursued. It was hard then, and it's hard now. It is very hard. We have our facts and our demons, and they have their facts and their demons, and the kind of dialogue that he was seeking was difficult to do in his day. It's difficult to do in our day, but it's absolutely imperative that we keep trying. 750,000 dead because it didn't work last time.
James, Katrina?
James, please.
The thing that keeps coming to mind for me is what he learned in the South on the trips that he took there, and one of those things is led directly to the career in landscape architecture, because he saw the South as the opposite of what he thought there should be. He thought there should be town squares like there were in New England and in the North. And that fostered democracy. It fostered a kind of community that could be shared. And he didn't see that in the South. And to the extent that maybe he believed in perfectibility, if not perfection itself, landscape architecture gave him an opportunity to try to plant those kinds of democratic spaces wherever he could.
I wanted to pick up on what Geraldine said about facts and demons, and we have ours and they have theirs. And I think there's much more than this, but the quick take that Olmsted disagreed with often led to no dialogue, no debate, no discussion. And I think in the parks, I know Central Park obviously better than others, there's a sense of egalitarian spirit and people coming together. Maybe not as much as one would seek in this great city, and there's Prospect Park and there are other parks, but that spirit of a public space as an antidote to private space, I think was really visible during the COVID pandemic when people were forced to find public spaces. And people used Central Park in ways that, and discovered Central Park in ways that had not been the case recently. I also think the idea of public space made in the public spirit is critical. And I was struck by the New York Times, which had a beautiful photo essay. This was maybe in April. And there were maybe 600 comments. The comments were not just, hi, I love Olmsted. People had their stories about the parks they loved, about the places they grew up in or connected to. And people corrected the Times. Why didn't you include this? And why not this? And it was one of the most interactive, intelligent, happy spaces. And I think that's a testament to how people feel about parks in good days. But maybe there would be a way to bring the writing to bear, have readings in parks around the
There
country.
you go. Well, I think it's true that the writing expressed frustration, and disappointment, and anger, and in the shortcomings, the societal shortcomings and abuses he discovered on his road trips. Maybe unable to correct them with the power of the pen, he did it with the power of the blueprint. Gave us just that kind of refuge in so many places that we particularly needed in these last 2
And
years.
I think the history of Central Park has also now acknowledged the displacement of people, the
Yes.
Seneca Village, and the, the messy, ugly history, but honoring those communities has become part of the park spirit. And the statue of, is it Harriet Tubman and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, I believe.
Right.
There's still a lot of war memorials.
Yes, but they're the first real women to be portrayed. It was only Alice in Wonderland and Mother
Oh my,
Goose.
Alice in Wonderland. Oh.
We need to turn to our audience questions. I hope there are a lot of them. And for that, I'm going to turn the program back to Dee Dee.
Well, thank you, Harold. We do have quite a few, and I think we'll start with one which appears fairly regularly in the questions. Our listeners today are curious about Olmsted and his attitudes towards Indigenous peoples. What did he talk about? What did he say? Or did he say anything? And I'll give that to any one of you to respond to.
Look blankly. I'm not aware that he wrote much at all about Native people, even when he went out west, far west.
He wrote, he didn't, I can't recall any in the two reporting trips that I'm most familiar with. He was very interested in Mexicans and people on the border and wrote extensively about his impressions and also the role of that border as a safe haven for runaway enslaved people, and how the Mexicans gave them shelter, and how it was a better place for a Black person. But I don't actually recall any writing on Native Americans in the work that I'm familiar with.
Neither do I.
Well, and I'll leap in a previous conversation with Olmsted, we talked with Ethan Carr and Rolf Diamant, who have written about Olmsted and Yosemite. And I think they agree with you that it was a blind spot at the very minimum, and that he did not really address Indigenous peoples. And in fact, he did not recognize that they were engaging in ecological practices when they burned various aspects of Yosemite, which gave great vistas. So I think they concluded it was definitely a blind spot when it came to his writing. So I've got a question. I think this one's probably for James. This person inquires about Olmsted basically upping the reputation of the New York Times as he served as a roving reporter. And so she wants to know, how did this occur, that he actually helped enhance the reputation? And then I guess a follow-on question, given the fact that he was helping enhance that reputation, why is it he's not appearing in any of these New York Times histories?
Well, to take the second one first, yeah, that one has occurred to me and I don't have an answer. It would make it easier preparing for something like this if you could see where he fit in. I mean, it would make that just that much simpler. I think Raymond had other people that he sent out as time went on. This was certainly one of the first ones. So yes, that did boost the paper's reputation, but it also set a pattern, and the pattern Katrina articulated it better in Olmsted's words in a couple of places. But Raymond's idea was you would go there and see for yourself and send that back. And over time, I think between the 1850s, when Olmsted was doing this for the Times, and the Times was still brand new, and the time of the Civil War, that became something the Times was known for. Probably the other papers too, because the competition was cutthroat, and in some ways, Horace Greeley, I think, wanted to be Raymond, and maybe Raymond wanted to be Horace Greeley. And so I think from that standpoint, what's important about Olmsted was he was, if not the first, certainly one of the first to go and see and send back. And also, if you think about how he did it, just the mechanics of being a correspondent. He wrote some of those columns, the first, I think, 7 or 8, somewhere in the hotels he didn't like, or somewhere in the South, and I guess sent them back by mail, and then returned to New York and wrote most of them from here, off the kind of voluminous notes that he must have kept later, because one of the great things about him as a reporter was his ability to get people to open up. And he did that partly by not always saying he was a reporter, which you can do if it's just now under the ethics. You can do that if it's not necessarily a situation where the person has to know. If you're just sort of generally gathering the scene. And so to some extent, he relied on his memory once he was back in New York, and his memory and his notes must have been very, very good.
I mentioned one, first of all, on a previous call, we all remarked how the post office was more efficient, perhaps back then, which is a statement about public goods.
Now having, Katrina, I'm sorry, now I'm in the position, having written a book about stamps, I guess I don't want to fall into defending the Postal Service, although I might.
I will tell you that Frederick Law Olmsted would like this. When we publish pieces about Save the Post Office, they're often #1 on our site.
Really?
Yes, but I was going to say, did the New York Times, I should know this, but The Nation, like The Economist, had no bylines until about 1917. So we have an index which will tell you it was Henry James or Frederick Law Olmsted. So I don't know if that played a role in how.
That's what I was, that's the thing that I left out when I was saying his pieces were signed, but they were signed yeoman.
Right.
There were very few, as far as I know, very few bylines in the paper, really until around the time of World War II, I would think.
Yes, it was 1917 here, yeah.
World War I.
And well, I think we were even a little later than that. But the point was, many newspapers in that era had pseudonyms like that were sort of catchy and amusing in their way, almost like serial novels, you know. And so I think people had to have known to look for yeoman, and that yeoman was a consistent voice. That's another thing of the importance of what Raymond did. It was one person over an extended period. And if you read the New York Times regularly, even if you didn't know it was Frederick Law Olmsted, you knew it was the same person. So you could see how he was changing as he went along.
Footnote, he thought he nominated yeoman at one point as the name for the nation.
That's so interesting. I will say that there are the stories of Civil War correspondents who committed their copy to the post office because there was censorship at the telegraph level. And there are lots of stories, and one of the more famous, although it doesn't involve the U.S. mail, is a New York Times writer who covered the Battle of Bull Run sent a dispatch about a Union victory. And then when the battle turned in the afternoon into a Confederate victory, tried to file in the telegraph office in Washington and was refused. And guess who the reporter was? Henry Raymond himself.
That's
He
right.
had to take the Acela back to New York. So New York Times readers did not know that the Union had lost for an extra day
Wow.
because of censorship.
Yeah.
And yes, we could depend on the mail in those days.
So I've got, we're coming near the end of our time, and I've got one question that will be great for all of you that relates to Olmsted writing his own obituary. So if you were speculating as to what he would write in this obituary, would he highlight his writing as one of the key aspects of his life? What do you think he would do if he were writing that obituary today? And we'll start with Geraldine.
I don't know that he would, because I think when he finally was able to bring all his disparate talents and interests together in the work of Central Park, it so absorbed him. And then he never really wavered. You know, he went on to do the Biltmore Gardens, Stanford campus, Cal campus, all the cities and towns you can hardly spit without hitting an Olmsted or the work of his sons that he's so influenced. So I think he would not emphasize it, but that doesn't mean we can't.
James, how about you?
I agree with Geraldine, and the reason I was smiling there as you were talking was I was trying to picture how Bob McFadden, Robert D. McFadden, the great rewrite reporter and now obituary writer at the New York Times would do it. And I was trying to picture a lead that had all three careers in it. Frederick Law Olmsted, Bob would do it better than this, but you know, who went from being a newspaper correspondent to find 3 words for the Sanitary Commission that explain that, to designing Central Park and dozens of other open spaces that reshaped communities, and go on from there. I admire Bob, and that doesn't do what he would do justice, but Olmsted would deserve it.
The one thing I would say is I read the obituaries every day faithfully because it's the history in our newspapers.
Yes.
And I think in that sense, just bringing to life what Olmsted, the many parts of Olmsted, and maybe there's something about the landscape architect of parks, words, and publications.
Yeah,
So that's the headline, Katrina. You've got the headline.
I would agree with the way James constructed his McFadden-esque lead, but I think in the end, he would call himself the father of landscape architecture and the organizer of Central Park. Forget about Calvert Vaux.
Although he didn't like the term landscape architecture.
Is that right?
He'd say park maker.
Okay.
And but I think, again, I would, not to be presumptuous, but I would suggest that his writing would be in the second league.
Well, we're going to give Harold the final word here. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I dare say we could have gone on for several more hours on this today, but I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I want to remind everyone that Olmsted 200 is still in full swing and will run throughout 2022. We are posting new and diverse programs nearly every day, and the calendar is chock-a-block with activities across the country. Save the date now, July 19, for our next conversation with Olmsted, Engaging the Next Generation. This time we will be meeting with young leaders in landscape architecture who will discuss the profession that Olmsted has made possible and explore his enduring influence. And of course, I want to repeat, we would love to have you join us in Chicago as we celebrate Olmsted in that great city. And please take a look at the calendar for other events. Finally, check out the website Olmsted 200. Use the hashtag Celebrate Olmsted and spread the word. And as we conclude today, I hope if you've not already seen it, you will enjoy Niagara Falls all lit up on his birthday as part of our way of recognizing Olmsted's remarkable legacy. So have a great summer, everyone. We will meet again in July. And thanks so much to Harold and our wonderful panelists for a fantastic conversation.
I'm
Thanks
off to
again.
Delacorte Park.